Amanda is Nature United's Director of Strategic Partnerships, advancing worldwide government relations and corporate partnerships. She also leads Nature United's Natural Climate Solutions Program. Previously, Amanda spent a decade with the Nature Conservancy, or TNC. That's Nature United's global affiliate, where she worked with landowners to permanently conserve their lands, supported the president and CEO as his outreach manager, and worked as a policy advisor to affect U.S. federal energy, transportation, and public lands legislation. Amanda has previously been the executive director of the Capital Land Trust, a regional land trust, and president of the Washington Association of Land Trusts, advocating for conservation funding and policies. Amanda holds a Master's of Business Administration from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and she's now based in Ottawa, where she tells me she and her husband have a mission to introduce their son to as many American and Canadian national parks, state parks, provincial and territory parks as possible, a goal we probably all have. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, Risa, for the very nice introduction. I'm going to put my phone here so I can try to stay on time. I am so excited to be here. This is really awesome. It's been a pleasure to be on the steering committee for the last 6 months or so, and just seeing everybody here today, it's just really energizing to see how many people know that this is such an important issue to be dealing with right now. Oops, I was doing these slides, but don't look at this one. Okay, here we go. So if there's one message I want to leave you with today, it's that there's huge potential for nature-based solutions in Canada. Not only does Canada have huge carbon stores in the boreal, temperate rainforests and coastal wetlands, and restoration potential, especially in the south, we also have the institutional frameworks to accelerate their application. We have the political will, we have policy frameworks like carbon pricing, and we have strong markets. And we also have a lot of really great conservation, restoration, natural infrastructure, and climate programs already with us. And they provide a great foundation to build off of. On top of all that, Indigenous communities have been managing these lands and waters for thousands of years. They have a wealth of knowledge about what it means to steward healthy and resilient lands and waters. Canada is well positioned to be a global leader in nature-based climate solutions. So there are so many people here today, so I thought it would be helpful to make sure we all have a shared definition of nature-based solutions. These are efforts to protect and improve ecosystems that have societal and environmental benefits. In the context of climate change, we're talking about those nature-based solutions that both mitigate climate change as well as help nature and people adapt to the impacts of climate change and become more resilient, all while delivering other benefits for biodiversity and people. Nature-based solutions in action. Over the next 2 days, we're going to hear about a lot of examples about how nature-based solutions are already working on the ground in Canada. We're going to, and how they're addressing those twin crises of climate and biodiversity. We're going to kind of look at these 4 main buckets of nature-based solutions. So the first one around natural infrastructure, how restoring coastlands and wetlands can provide municipal services like clean drinking water or stormwater retention. We'll look at well-managed protected areas, like the protected areas of the Great Bear Rainforest that are protecting big carbon stores as well as providing benefits for First Nations. Or the Rouge River National Urban Park, where restoration is providing adaptation and resilience. Another great example of restoration in Canada is the 40 projects that are being implemented under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Coastal Restoration Fund. Changes in land management is another big bucket, especially changes in management to forestry and ag lands, such as fertilizer and manure management on ag lands or harvest cycles on forest lands. These can benefit both industry by creating sustainable resource industries as well as benefiting nature. As I said, these solutions are already being implemented in many ways across Canada, and I'm really excited for the next day and a half to see how those examples from the project leaders. By their definition, nature-based solutions provide a host of co-benefits for people and nature. Economic, like sustainable industries and jobs and reduced operational costs. Environmental, clean air and water, soil health, biodiversity. Disaster risk resilience from drought, flood, fire, and storms. Something important, I think, for us all to think about over the next day and a half is that these different drivers, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions reductions or adaptation or resilience, the different drivers are going to lead us to different solutions. And something for us all to think about is how can we maximize the nature-based solutions that we design and implement to look across these different benefits. And we also need to figure out how to do that without making it overly complicated and without having the perfect be the enemy of the good. So a key question when we're evaluating nature-based solutions is how much greenhouse gas emissions can be avoided or sequestered by specific actions in conservation, restoration, and management. Some people refer to these actions, those that provide really the mitigation benefits, as natural climate solutions. One of the leading studies on natural climate solutions was led by Nature United's global affiliate, and it found that natural climate solutions could provide 37% of the cost-effective carbon emissions needed to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. That is such a weird year to say, 2100. But that's what we need to be thinking about, especially when we're thinking about nature-based climate solutions that we need to put into the ground today to have emission benefits down the road. The next year, a new team, a US team, got together and they stepped out in that analysis to look at natural climate solutions in the US. And they found that collectively natural climate solutions are equivalent to almost a quarter of US annual emissions and could provide 300 megatons of emissions reductions annually at a price of only $10 a ton. Now Nature United is leading a similar analysis for Canada, looking at specific unique circumstances in the Canadian context. We're teaming up with 16 institutions, including governments and nonprofits and universities. There's already a lot of information out there about the mitigation potential of specific natural climate solutions like forest management. But this study will be the first time that it aggregates the potential reductions in land-based emissions across all of these pathways in forest lands, ag lands, wetlands, and grasslands. It looks at the reductions in 2030 and 2050 at different carbon price points, $10, $25, $50, $100. The pathways fall into 3 or 4 major groups. So we have the forest land pathways. And each of these groups represent pathways, those 4 buckets I displayed earlier. So the protected areas through avoided conversion, restoration, and changes in management, especially in forest and ag lands. The research is really careful to constrain analyses to pathways that did not impinge on society's ability to deliver fiber and food, pathways that include safeguards for biodiversity and that are economically feasible. You know, there is a lot of science out there about natural climate solutions, and some of it has pretty high projections of the mitigation potential we can get from planting trees and things like that. We're trying to give really real data so that decision makers and government and people developing climate action plans and NGOs can take the science and the data and trust it to invest in those solutions and put the money on the ground. So there's a number of certain uncertainties that we're adding to this study and really trying to give you a good estimate that you can make your decisions on. The study will be published later this year, but existing evidence suggests that Canada's land and seascapes have the potential to mitigate hundreds of megatons of CO2 annually, if we have the right enabling conditions in place. Mitigation potential is based on many factors, including ecosystem type and the rate of carbon absorption of those systems. So if you can see on these maps, the areas in green and blue, in the forests in BC and southern Ontario and Quebec, the Atlantic provinces, and areas in the boreal. Those areas have high mitigation potential through something known as net primary productivity, which is the ability of those systems to absorb carbon. Primary productivity also has a positive relationship with biodiversity. So a lot of the places that have these really good mitigation potentials based on the ecosystems also tend to have high levels of biodiversity. What we can do is use this mitigation potential in conjunction with what we already know about species and habitat condition and degradation, and start to prioritize specific natural climate solution pathways for specific geographies. So, for example, it may be more appropriate to put restoration in the south, where you have these high net primary productivities and you also have some degraded systems. Protected areas may be more appropriate in areas of the boreal or the north, where primary productivity is low, but you have big areas to make up for that. You have intact habitat and important species. So as I said, while I'm not going to share specific results today or give you lots of numbers of megatons, I'm not that wonky. We can say, based on the current research that's out there and the research underway, we can have a lot of confidence that Canada's ecosystems can contribute hundreds of megatons annually in emissions, either voided emissions or through sequestration. And there's some other key takeaways coming out of the study. One is that some of the greatest near-term opportunity does come in avoided conversion, like through protected areas, or through improved management. And it can also be quite cost-effective. That said, restoration is still important. Restoration has those important qualities for adaptation and resilience, and like I said, we need to start getting those solutions in the ground now if we have a hope of realizing their emissions reduction benefits down the road. And another key takeaway, which obviously is probably no surprise to anyone, is a lot of these natural climate solution pathways, their potential occur in Canada's public landscapes and in the traditional territories of Indigenous people. So really, these natural climate solutions can't be successful without the leadership of Indigenous people, and all natural climate solution pathways must respect Indigenous rights. A couple other key takeaways, and this is, again, one of the unique parts of this study. We're looking at some key uncertainties of how natural climate solution pathways can occur in Canada. One really important one is the influence of albedo, which I just learned through this study what that means. It's how solar radiation is reflected by different types of land cover, which impacts the cooling and warming properties of the land. So in Canada, this albedo effect is pretty significant and has impact on the appropriateness of numerous forest pathways, especially the afforestation or increasing tree canopy in the north. It's also important to recognize the critical impact that wildland fires have on nature-based solutions. Actions to mitigate wildland fires and the ability to predict those and quantify those is really hard at a coarse scale, so those really need to be taken into account at finer planning and analytical scales. So I just talked a lot about the mitigation potential of three of those buckets: protected areas through avoided conversion, restoration, improved management. But what about natural infrastructure? Natural assets such as aquifers, forests, wetlands, and soil can often provide the same level of service as built infrastructure, while providing co-benefits for people and nature, including adaptation and reducing risk, as well as saving capital and operating costs. And as I said, they're often more resilient to changes in climate. This is a really cool initiative in Canada that probably represents the potential for natural infrastructure across the country, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. Numerous pilots across the country are focusing on inventorying natural assets and assessing nature's ability to provide the same level of service as the built infrastructure. One pilot that I thought was really cool is in the city of Nanaimo, which looked at the value of its Buttertubs Marsh Conservation Area. Kind of just really love that name, Buttertubs. marsh conservation area. But they demonstrated that the conservation area has the same stormwater detention as built infrastructure. And not only that, but it would continue to do so in heightened climate scenarios, which built infrastructure probably would not. So coming back to the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity. By definition, nature-based solutions are intended to protect and enhance the environment, and they can specifically protect biodiversity. As Ambassador Fuller mentioned, the Convention on Biological Diversity defines 5 drivers of biodiversity loss: climate change, habitat change, invasive species overexploitation, and pollution. All of these drivers have at least a high level of impact on at least one of Canada's major biomes. So we need to worry about all of these things. And most of the nature-based solutions that I've been talking about not only mitigate climate change, but also either prevent habitat loss associated with land use change or restore ecological conditions and habitat connectivity for native biodiversity. Not that you're supposed to read all the little words on this slide, but hopefully the distribution of colors gives you an idea that depending on the nature-based solution that we choose, it will have different benefits for biodiversity. One example is how improved forest management in the boreal, which can help avoid logging-related emissions in carbon-rich forests and wetlands, can also provide high-quality habitat for caribou. So as we design these nature-based solutions and projects, we should strive to reduce threats to biodiversity and ensure we have biodiversity and social safeguards in place. A couple more examples that a lot of people like to say, replacing native habitat with poplar plantations might have a great mitigation benefit, but it's going to be bad for biodiversity. There's also some conservation things that we can do that aren't great for mitigation, like restoring peatlands, well pads and peatlands. There's actually a near-term net positive methane emission. So if all we were doing is looking at mitigation, we'd say, oh, that's a bad pathway. But obviously restoring peatlands is great for a lot of other reasons. So I think the key here is to look across the many benefits that any nature-based solution could provide and try to optimize those solutions based on the most urgent needs and the current condition of the land. So just leaving with you for some parting thoughts as we continue on the next day and a half. Nature-based solutions are available to us now. They're affordable. They provide a range of benefits for people in nature. It's clear that the potential for nature-based solutions in Canada is great. And just like Dale was saying, we need an all-above approach to reducing emissions. We need an all-above approach to natural climate solutions. We need to do natural infrastructure and protected areas and restoration and changes in management. To accelerate their implementation, we need the right enabling conditions in place. I mentioned we already have a lot of these in Canada, and we just need to build from those. We need federal and provincial regulations and policy incentives. We need market shifts to climate-smart products and nature-based offsets. We need standards and principles for good nature-based solution programs and projects, and we need public and private investment. At their core, nature-based solutions are really about a shift in our perspective on how we view, value, and interact with the land and water. It's about recognizing how actions to protect and enhance the environment can also benefit people. For all these many reasons, it's important to recognize the role of Indigenous people in designing and implementing nature-based solutions. It's important to recognize that they've been stewarding this land since time immemorial and have a wealth of knowledge that we can use as we move forward. I'm very excited to hear Steve and Nita come talk up next and really look forward to spending the next day and a half with you guys. Thanks.